He fed 2 starving alien children. 10 years later, they returned to save humanity. HFY, the starving strangers. The asteroid storm had been raging for 3 days, and Jake Morrison was running out of everything that mattered. Food, water, patience, and hope seemed to drain away as fast as the emergency power cells that kept Titan's Edge mining station barely functional. The station's warning sirens had long since fallen silent, their batteries dead like everything else that wasn't absolutely critical for survival. Jake wiped grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades and surveyed his workshop. At 45, he had spent the last 8 years maintaining the mechanical heart of this forgotten outpost on the edge of human space. The work was honest, if lonely, and it kept his mind off the things he had left behind after his military service ended badly. The station housed maybe 30 souls on a good day, mostly miners and traders who valued the isolation as much as the rare Earth deposits buried in the surrounding asteroids. The storm had caught everyone off guard. What started as routine electromagnetic disturbance had escalated into a 3-day siege of magnetic fields and debris that made space travel impossible. Supply ships couldn't dock, and the emergency reserves were stretched thin. Jake had been living on nutrient bars and recycled water, same as everyone else. He was checking the atmospheric recycling system for the 5th time that day when he heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from the storage room at the back of his workshop. Jake paused, listening carefully. The sound came again, too deliberate to be settling debris or cooling metal. Jake grabbed his plasma torch, not as a weapon but as a light source, and approached the storage room cautiously. The door was slightly ajar, which was wrong. He always kept it sealed to prevent contamination of his spare parts. Pushing it open slowly, he stepped inside and swept the light across the cluttered space. 2 pairs of luminous blue eyes stared back at him from behind a stack of engine components. Jake stopped breathing for a moment. The eyes belonged to small figures huddled together, and as his light fell on them fully, he realized he was looking at children. Alien children, but children nonetheless. They appeared to be from the Zephyrian species, recognized by their pale silver skin that seemed to glow softly in the darkness and their large, expressive eyes. One looked to be about 12 years old, the other perhaps 9. They were clearly terrified, pressing themselves further into the corner as Jake's light found them. The older one wrapped her arms protectively around the younger, and Jake could see they were both painfully thin. Their clothing was torn and dirty, and they shivered in the cold storage room. "Hey there," Jake said softly, lowering his torch so it wouldn't blind them. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The older girl spoke in rapid Zephyrian, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's universal translator, a basic model, caught fragments. Something about hiding, being lost, and hunger. Jake set his torch down and slowly crouched to their level. "You're hungry," he said, understanding clear in his voice. "How long have you been here?" The older girl seemed to understand some basic standard. 3 sons, she said carefully, her accent thick but understandable. "Hide from storm. 3 days." They had been hiding in his storage room for 3 days while the station had been on emergency rations. Jake felt something twist in his chest. These children had been starving while he complained about nutrient bars. "Come on," he said gently, standing and extending his hand. "Let's get you some food." The girls exchanged a look, and Jake saw the older one nod slightly to her younger companion. Slowly, carefully, they emerged from their hiding place. Standing, Jake could see how small and fragile they really were. The younger one couldn't weigh more than 60 pounds, and both moved with the careful steps of those who had learned to conserve energy. Jake led them to his small living quarters attached to the workshop. It wasn't much, just a bunk, a tiny kitchenette, and a table, but it was warm and private. He gestured for them to sit while he checked his food supplies. The reality was stark. He had enough nutrient bars for maybe 2 more days, a half-full water recycler, and some freeze-dried vegetables he had been saving for when the storm passed. By any reasonable calculation, feeding these children would put his own survival at risk. Jake looked at the 2 girls sitting at his table, their eyes following his every movement with a mixture of hope and fear. The younger one was leaning against her sister, exhaustion clear in every line of her small body. He made his decision without hesitation. Jake heated water in his small thermal unit and began preparing what he privately called real food. Mix of freeze-dried vegetables, nutrient bar chunks, and some protein powder that would actually taste like something. It wasn't gourmet, but it would be warm, filling, and nutritious. While the food prepared, he tried to communicate with the girls. The older one, he learned, was named Zara. The younger was Kira. They had been traveling with their guardian on a transport ship when the storm hit. Their ship had made an emergency docking at the station, but their guardian had gone to arrange repairs and never returned. Guardian not come back, Zara explained haltingly. Ship leave. We hide. Jake felt anger rise in his chest. Someone had abandoned these children during an emergency, but he pushed the emotion aside and focused on the immediate need. The food was ready. He served it in his 2 good bowls, giving them larger portions than he kept for himself. The girls looked at the steaming food with wonder, as if they hadn't expected kindness from a human stranger. Zara said something in Zephyrian to her sister, and both began to eat slowly, savoring each bite. Jake watched them eat and felt something shift inside him. For 8 years, he had lived a solitary existence, convinced that avoiding connections was safer than risking them. But seeing these children alone and afraid in a hostile environment reminded him of why he had once chosen to serve others. You can stay here until the storm passes, he told them. It's safe. Zara looked up from her bowl, her large eyes shimmering with gratitude. Thank you, she said in careful standard. You are kind human. Over the next 2 days, Jake shared his dwindling supplies with Zara and Kira. He learned that they were sisters, orphaned when their parents died in an industrial accident on their homeworld. They had been in the care of a Zephyrian social worker who was transporting them to relatives on another planet when the storm stranded them. The girls proved to be quick learners and eager to help despite their situation. Kira, despite her youth, had an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that impressed Jake. Zara was protective and mature beyond her years, always ensuring her sister ate first and slept warmly. On the 3rd day after finding them, the storm finally began to clear. Jake was showing Kira how to calibrate a power coupling when the workshop's communication system crackled to life. Attention Titan's Edge Station, came a formal voice speaking accented standard. This is Captain Veltar of the Zephyrian vessel, Starborn Dawn. We are responding to reports of missing juveniles. Please respond. Jake looked at the girls, seeing both relief and sadness in their expressions. Their rescue had arrived, but it also meant goodbye. Stay here, he told them gently, then activated the communicator. This is Jake Morrison, station mechanic. I have 2 Zephyrian children safe in my workshop. Within an hour, 3 Zephyrian officials arrived at Jake's workshop. They were tall, elegant beings dressed in formal robes, and they moved with the careful dignity of those accustomed to authority. The leader, Captain Veltar, was clearly relieved to find the children safe, but seemed puzzled by the situation. The human fed us, Zara explained to them in Zephyrian, her words coming fast and excited. He shared his food when he had little. He kept us warm and safe. The captain turned to Jake with an expression that might have been surprise. You cared for them during the emergency, despite the resource shortage? Jake shrugged. They were hungry kids. What else was I supposed to do? Veltar exchanged glances with his companions, and Jake caught fragments of their rapid conversation through his translator. Words like unusual and noteworthy came through clearly. As the officials prepared to leave with Zara and Kira, the older girl approached Jake one final time. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pendant on a silver chain. The pendant was made of some kind of crystal that seemed to glow with its own inner light. My mother's, she said softly, pressing it into Jake's hand. For kindness. For being good when others were not. Jake tried to refuse the gift, but Zara's small hands closed his fingers around the pendant firmly. Keep, she insisted. Remember Zara and Kira. We remember Jake Morrison always. The officials were patient but clearly eager to leave. As they reached the workshop door, Zara turned back one last time. "Someday," she said with the solemnity that only children could muster, "we help you. We not forget." Then they were gone, leaving Jake alone in his workshop with an empty food storage and a strange crystal pendant that seemed to pulse with warmth against his palm. The other station residents had questions, of course. Why had he harbored alien children without reporting them? Why had he used critical resources on strangers? Some accused him of poor judgment, others of being too soft for frontier life. Jake endured their criticism in silence, understanding their concerns but not regretting his choice. That night, as he sat in his workshop wearing the pendant beneath his shirt, he realized that for the first time in years, he felt like himself again. The person he had been before fear and disappointment had taught him to keep his distance from others. The pendant seemed to pulse against his chest, a reminder that sometimes the most important choices were the simplest ones. He had seen children, in need, and responded with basic human decency. Nothing more, nothing less. As Jake finally prepared for sleep, he wondered briefly if he would ever see Zara and Kira again. The galaxy was vast, and the chances of their paths crossing seemed impossibly small. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness had been noted by powers far greater than a mining station's worth of gossiping humans. Nor could he imagine that two grateful children would grow into influential adults who never forgot the human mechanic, who shared his last meal with strangers. The pendant grew warm against his skin as he drifted off to sleep, and Jake Morrison had no idea that he had just planted seeds that would reshape his entire future. The mysterious departure. The morning after the Zephyrian officials departed with Zara and Kira, Titan's Edge Station felt different to Jake Morrison. The storm had passed, leaving behind the crisp silence of space and the gradual return of normal operations. Supply ships began docking again, bringing fresh provisions and news from the outer colonies. Life resumed its predictable rhythm, but Jake found himself distracted and oddly restless. He stood in his workshop, the crystal pendant hidden beneath his work shirt, its gentle warmth a constant reminder of his unexpected visitors. The storage room where he had found the girls seemed larger now, emptier in a way that had nothing to do with the spare parts he had reorganized there. "Morrison!" The sharp voice belonged to Station Administrator Collins, a man who viewed Jake's workshop as an unfortunate necessity, and Jake himself as barely tolerable. Collins strode into the workshop without invitation, his expression stern and businesslike. "We need to talk." Jake continued calibrating a fuel injector, not looking up. "About what?" "About your recent guests." Collins positioned himself where Jake would have to acknowledge him. "I've received inquiries from Colonial Security about your harboring of undocumented aliens during the emergency." Jake set down his tools and finally faced the administrator. Collins was a thin man with the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time under artificial lighting, and his perpetual frown had carved permanent lines around his mouth. "They were children," Jake said simply. "Hungry children." "They were unregistered aliens present on a human station without proper documentation," Collins countered. "There are protocols for these situations, Morrison. Procedures that exist for good reasons." Jake picked up another component and began cleaning it methodically. "What procedures? Let them starve while filling out forms?" Collins's face reddened slightly. "The proper course would have been to report their presence immediately to station security, who would have contacted the appropriate authorities. Instead, you took it upon yourself to harbor them, using resources allocated for human personnel during an emergency situation. Station security is you, Collins, and 3 part-time volunteers. The appropriate authorities were 3 days away because of the storm." Jake's voice remained level, but there was steel underneath. "Those kids would have been dead before anyone official showed up." "That's not the point." Collins pulled out a tablet and began reading from it. "Colonial Security has flagged this incident in your file. Unauthorized contact with alien species, resource misappropriation during emergency conditions, and failure to follow proper reporting protocols." Jake stopped working and looked directly at Collins. Is there going to be disciplinary action? Collins hesitated, clearly having hoped to intimidate Jake into an apology. Not at this time, but your contract is up for review in 6 months, and this incident will be considered. After Collins left, Jake tried to return to his normal routine, but the encounter had stirred something in him. He had spent 8 years on Titan's Edge specifically because it was the kind of place where people minded their own business and asked few questions. The irony that his first genuine human interaction in months was an interrogation about showing basic decency was not lost on him. Over the following days, Jake noticed subtle changes in how the other station residents treated him. Some seemed more distant, viewing his actions as reckless or naive. Others, particularly some of the miners who had children of their own back home, made quiet comments of approval. The station's cook, an elderly woman named Sarah, began leaving extra portions of real food in Jake's quarters without explanation, but it was the isolation that affected him most. Jake had grown comfortable with solitude, but the brief presence of Zara and Kira had reminded him what it felt like to care for others. Their absence left a void that his previous contentment couldn't quite fill. 3 weeks after the storm, Jake was working late on a stubborn atmospheric processor when his personal communicator chimed with an incoming message. The sender identification was encrypted, which was unusual for Titan's Edge's simple communication system. The message was brief. Jake Morrison, thank you for kindness to Zara and Kira. They are safe and well. Your actions have been noted by those who matter. This debt will be repaid. A friend. Jake stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. He had no idea who had sent it or how they had obtained his personal communication code. The message could have come from the Zephyrian officials who had collected the girls, or from someone else entirely. Either way, it suggested that his simple act of hospitality had attracted more attention than he had realized. The pendant around his neck seemed to pulse warmer as he read the message, though that could have been his imagination. Months passed. Jake's contract was renewed without comment, Collins apparently deciding that the administrative hassle of replacing him outweighed any concerns about his incident. The routine of station life continued, but Jake found himself changed by the experience in subtle ways. He began taking more interest in the other residents, learning their names and stories. When a young miner was injured in an accident, Jake spent his off-duty time helping to modify the man's quarters for wheelchair access. When Sarah's kitchen equipment failed during a supply delay, Jake worked through the night to repair it using improvised parts. The other residents began coming to him with problems that went beyond simple mechanical issues. Jake discovered he had a talent for listening and an ability to see solutions that others missed. Without realizing it, he had become someone the station depended on for more than just keeping the machines running. One evening, exactly 6 months after the storm, Jake was closing his workshop when he found an envelope that had been slipped under his door. Inside was a photograph of 2 Zephyrian girls standing in what appeared to be a garden filled with alien flowers. They were older, well-dressed, and smiling broadly at the camera. On the back, in careful standard script, was written, Zara and Kira, grateful always. You gave us hope when we had none. Jake studied the photograph for a long time, noting how healthy and happy the girls appeared. Zara looked more confident, her posture suggesting growing maturity. Kira had grown taller and bore a striking resemblance to her older sister. Both wore the same pendant design that Jake carried, suggesting some deeper significance to the crystal jewelry. He placed the photograph on his workbench where he could see it while working. It became a reminder of why simple human decency mattered, even when, especially when, no one was watching or keeping score. Years passed. Jake's reputation, as both a mechanic and an unofficial problem solver, grew throughout the sector. Other stations began requesting his services for particularly challenging repairs, and he occasionally traveled to nearby colonies to help with complex technical issues. He discovered that his military engineering background, combined with years of frontier improvisation, had given him a unique skill set. The pendant remained his constant companion, though he rarely thought about it consciously. It had become part of him, like an old scar or a familiar tool. Sometimes, during particularly challenging repairs, he would absently touch it through his shirt, and creative solutions would seem to emerge from nowhere. Jake received no more mysterious messages, though occasionally supply ships would deliver small packages addressed to him, with no sender identification. They contained rare metals useful for specialized repairs, advanced tool components he couldn't afford, and once, a bottle of whiskey that was probably worth more than his annual salary. He learned to accept these gifts without question, understanding that asking too many questions about good fortune was a luxury frontier life rarely afforded. 10 years after the storm, Jake Morrison had become something of a legend in the outer colonies. The mechanic who could fix anything. The man who found solutions where others saw only problems. What he didn't know was that his reputation had spread far beyond human space, carried by trade networks and diplomatic channels into alien territories where such stories were noted and remembered. The crystal pendant had grown warmer over the years, its inner light visible even in bright workshop lighting. Sometimes Jake caught other aliens looking at it with recognition, though none had ever commented directly. He suspected it marked him in some way, identified him to those who knew what to look for. On the 10th anniversary of the storm, Jake was working alone in his expanded workshop when he heard an unusual sound outside. It was different from the normal docking procedures he knew by heart. Deeper, more resonant, like the hum of technology far more advanced than anything Titan's Edge usually saw. He stepped outside and looked up at the docking bays suspended above, the station's main hub. What he saw made him stop breathing. A ship unlike anything in the colonial fleet hung in the docking cradle, its hull gleaming with the same inner light as his pendant. It was massive yet graceful, clearly of alien design but far more luxurious than any vessel he had ever seen. Its very presence seemed to make the station's industrial structures look crude and primitive by comparison. As Jake watched, a passenger ramp extended from the ship's side, touching down on the station's main platform with barely a whisper. Two figures emerged, tall and elegant, moving with the confident grace of those accustomed to command. Even at this distance, Jake recognized them immediately. The luminous silver skin, the flowing movement, the way they seemed to glide rather than walk. Zephyrians, but not just any Zephyrians. These carried themselves with authority and power. As they approached his workshop, Jake's hand unconsciously went to the pendant beneath his shirt. It was pulsing with warmth now, almost hot against his skin. The two figures stopped before his workshop door, and Jake found himself looking into familiar blue eyes that had grown from fearful and desperate to confident and determined. "Hello, Jake Morrison," said the taller of the two, her voice carrying the musical accent he remembered but now refined by education and experience. "We told you we would not forget." Zara and Kira had returned, but they were no longer the frightened children he had sheltered during a storm. They had become something far more powerful, and they had traveled across the galaxy to find him. The pendant against his chest pulsed like a heartbeat as Jake realized his quiet life was about to change forever. The unexpected, returned Jake Morrison stood frozen in the doorway of his workshop, staring at the two elegant Zephyrian women who had once been hungry children hiding in his storage room. 10 years had transformed them completely. Where once there had been fear and desperation, now he saw confidence, authority, and something else, power. Real power. The kind that commanded luxury starships and crossed galactic distances on personal missions. Zara had grown tall and statuesque, her silver skin bearing the subtle patterns that marked high social status among her people. She wore a flowing garment that seemed to shift color in the station's artificial light, and jeweled pendants at her throat caught the reflection of her inner radiance. Kira, once the small child clinging to her sister, now stood nearly as tall, her bearing suggesting intelligence and strength. "You remember us," Zara said, and Jake heard the wonder in her voice, as if she had harbored some doubt that he would. "I could hardly forget," Jake managed, his voice rougher than he intended. "Though you've, changed considerably." Kira smiled, and for a moment Jake saw the child she had been. We grew up, Jake Morrison, but we never forgot the human who shared his food when he had little to spare. Jake became aware that their arrival had attracted attention. Station residents were gathering at a respectful distance, staring at the magnificent ship and its clearly important passengers. Collins appeared, looking flustered and uncertain, probably wondering if he should involve himself in what was obviously a significant diplomatic event. "Perhaps we could speak privately," Zara suggested, noticing the growing audience. "We have much to discuss." Jake nodded and gestured them into his workshop. The space that had once seemed adequate suddenly felt cramped and industrial in the presence of beings clearly accustomed to luxury. But as they entered, both women looked around with what appeared to be genuine interest. "This is where you work," Kira observed, running her fingers along the surface of his primary workbench. "Where you create solutions to problems others cannot solve." Jake raised an eyebrow. "How do you know about that?" "We know many things about Jake Morrison," Zara replied, settling gracefully into the single chair Jake kept for rare visitors. "Your reputation has spread farther than you might imagine. The human engineer who can repair anything, who finds creative solutions where others see only impossibility." Jake remained standing, still processing their presence. "What happened to you? After you left, I mean. Obviously things went well." The sisters exchanged a glance that reminded Jake powerfully of their childhood communication. Some things, it seemed, never changed. "We were fortunate," Kira began. "The relatives we were being transported to were part of the Zephyrian Trade Consortium, very influential, very wealthy. They adopted us," Zara continued, "gave us education, opportunities, guidance. We learned business, technology, diplomacy. By the time we came of age, we had proven ourselves capable of significant responsibility." Jake sensed there was more to the story. "And now we jointly oversee the consortium's engineering and development division," Kira said with obvious pride. "We are responsible for technological advancement and resource allocation across 15 sectors. We manage trade agreements with 12 species," Zara added, "including recently expanded commerce with human colonies." The implications of this began to sink in. These were not just successful aliens who had done well for themselves. These were powerful individuals at the highest levels of an interstellar trade organization. "That's impressive," Jake said, feeling the inadequacy of the word. "But I have to ask, why are you here? Titan's Edge isn't exactly a major hub of galactic commerce." Again, the sisters exchanged glances. This time, Jake detected something, like nervousness. "We came to see you," Zara said simply. "To thank you properly for what you did for us. To offer you something," Kira added. Jake felt a familiar wariness. In his experience, offers from powerful people usually came with complications. "What kind of offer?" Zara leaned forward slightly. "A position with the consortium, Chief of Engineering Development, based on our primary world. You would oversee technological innovation projects, lead teams of the galaxy's best engineers, and have resources beyond anything you could imagine. The salary would make you wealthy by any standard," Kira continued. "Full citizenship in the consortium, housing appropriate to your status, access to technologies centuries ahead of what exists in human space." Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what they were offering. It was by any measure an extraordinary opportunity. It was also completely unimaginable. "That's very generous," he said finally. "But I'm just a station mechanic with military training. I fix atmospheric processors and fuel injectors. I'm not qualified for the kind of position you're describing." "You are exactly qualified," Zara countered firmly. "We have studied your work, Jake Morrison. The solutions you create, the problems you solve. You have what our people call impossible thinking, the ability to see connections others miss, to combine technologies in ways that should not work but do. Humans call it improvisation," Kira added with a smile. "And you are exceptional at it, even among your own species." Jake walked to his workbench and picked up a component he had been modifying. "What you're describing sounds like a fantasy. People don't just get offered dream jobs by aliens they helped as children. People who show true kindness to strangers do, Zara said softly. When those strangers grow up to have the power to repay such kindness. Jake set down the component and turned back to face them. There has to be more to this. Positions like what you're describing aren't created just to repay old debts. The sisters were silent for a moment, and Jake saw something pass between them. A decision being made. You are correct, Zara admitted. There is more. The position we are offering is real, and it is yours if you want it. But there is also a problem we hope you might help us solve. What kind of problem? Kira stood and walked to the workshop's small window, looking out at their magnificent ship. A problem that threatens our homeworld. A mechanical failure of such complexity that our best engineers cannot find a solution. Our technology is advanced, Zara continued, but it is also highly specialized. Our engineers think in specific patterns, follow established protocols. When faced with a truly unprecedented problem, they become limited. But humans, Kira turned back to face Jake, humans think differently. You find solutions in chaos, create order from impossible situations. It is why human engineers are sought after throughout this sector, even though your technology is considered primitive. Jake felt pieces of a larger picture beginning to form. You need someone to solve a problem your people can't, and you thought of the human who once helped you. We thought of the human who saw hungry children and responded with immediate kindness, Zara corrected, who shared his resources without hesitation or calculation. That kind of thinking, that immediate response to need, it is exactly what we require. Jake was quiet for several minutes, considering. Outside his workshop, he could hear the excited conversations of station residents who had undoubtedly never seen anything like the Zephyrian ship. His pendant felt warm against his chest, a reminder of connections that transcended species and distance. What exactly is wrong on your homeworld? He asked finally. The relief on both women's faces was visible. They had clearly been uncertain whether he would even listen to their request. Our planet's core thermal regulation system is failing, Kira explained. It is ancient technology built by our ancestors using principles we no longer fully understand. The failure is progressive and will become catastrophic within a few months. How catastrophic? Total atmospheric collapse, Zara said simply. The death of our world and everyone on it. Jake felt his chest tighten. Population? 4 billion, Kira answered. The number hung in the air between them. Jake looked at these two women who had traveled across the galaxy to ask for his help, and he saw not the powerful figures they had become, but the frightened children they had once been. You could have sent engineers to study the problem, he pointed out. Why come personally? Because, Zara said, rising and approaching him, some requests require looking someone in the eyes. Some debts can only be asked to be repaid in person. She reached into her robes and withdrew an object that made Jake's breath catch. It was a pendant identical to the one he wore, but larger and more intricate. The crystal at its center pulsed, with the same inner light but brighter, more complex. This is our family's most precious artifact, she said, offering it to him. It belonged to our grandmother, and her grandmother before her. Kira and I discussed it at length before coming. Here. We want you to have it, Kira added, joining her sister. As a symbol of the trust we place in you. Jake looked at the pendant, then at the two women offering it. You're asking me to leave everything I know to travel to an alien world and solve a problem that your most advanced engineers cannot. We are asking you to save our people, Zara said simply, as you once saved us. Jake thought about Titan's Edge, about his workshop, about the quiet life he had built in the Outer Rim. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. It was safe. It was predictable. Then he thought about 4 billion lives hanging in the balance, about 2 grateful children who had grown into powerful adults who still remembered a simple act of kindness. He thought about the pendant around his neck, growing warm against his skin, and the way it had seemed to guide him toward creative solutions over the years. When would we leave? He asked. The smiles that lit up both women's faces were like sunrise. Immediately, Zara replied. If you are willing. Jake looked around his workshop one more time, at the tools and projects that had defined his life for the past decade. Then he looked at Zara and Kira, seeing in them both the frightened children he had helped and the powerful women they had become. I'll need to pack a few things, he said. As Jake gathered his essential tools and personal belongings, he felt the pendant against his chest pulsing in rhythm with his heartbeat. For 10 years, it had been a reminder of a simple choice to show kindness. Now it seemed to be guiding him toward something much larger. He had no idea that this decision would not only save a world, but transform him into something he had never imagined becoming, a bridge between species and a symbol of humanity's greatest strength. The luxury ship was even more impressive inside than out, but Jake barely noticed the opulent accommodations. His mind was already racing ahead to the problem waiting for him on the Zephyrian homeworld. As Titan's Edge station grew smaller in the viewports, Jake Morrison left behind the safety of the known for the uncertainty of the impossible. But for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The hidden crisis. The journey to the Zephyrian homeworld took 3 days through hyperspace, and Jake Morrison spent every waking hour trying to understand what he had gotten himself into. The luxury ship, which Zara had casually mentioned was called the Star Weaver's Dream, was a marvel of technology that made human spacecraft look like crude metal boxes by comparison. The sisters had provided him with a suite that was larger than his entire workshop on Titan's Edge, complete with a personal fabrication unit that could create anything from tools to clothing on demand. But what impressed Jake most was the ship's engineering section, which they had given him full access to study. Your technology is incredible, Jake told Kira, as she guided him through the ship's power systems on the second day. Energy efficiency. I've never seen materials that shouldn't be possible, control systems that seem to read the operator's mind. Kira's expression grew troubled. This is why our crisis is so frightening, Jake Morrison. Our ancestors created wonders we can barely comprehend, let alone reproduce. We have become maintainers of miracles we no longer understand. They were standing in the ship's engineering core, surrounded by crystalline structures that hummed with barely contained energy. Jake touched one of the control surfaces and felt it respond to his presence, information flowing into his mind in ways that bypassed his normal senses. How does this work? He asked, pulling his hand back in surprise. Neural interface technology, Zara explained, joining them. The crystals respond to brainwave patterns, allowing direct mental control of ship systems. It is standard on all our vessels. Jake looked at the pendant around his neck, which had grown noticeably warmer since boarding the ship. Is this connected to the same technology? In a way, Zara nodded. The pendants are made from the same base crystals, but they are much older. Family artifacts that have been passed down for generations. They choose their bearers, Kira added mysteriously. Not everyone can use them effectively. Jake was about to ask what she meant when the ship's communication system activated with a melodic chime. A holographic figure appeared in the center of the engineering bay, another Zephyrian, but this one looked haggard and desperate. Zara, Kira, the figure said without preamble. The situation has deteriorated faster than our models predicted. We may have days, not weeks. The sisters exchanged their characteristic silent look, but this time Jake could see real fear in their expressions. Elder Thane, Zara responded formally. This is Jake Morrison, the human engineer we discussed. Jake, this is Elder Thane, head of our world's technical council. Thane's eyes fixed on Jake with desperate hope. Human Morrison, please tell me you have experience with quantum thermal regulation systems integrated with planetary core dynamics. Jake felt a familiar sinking sensation. I've worked on thermal management for space stations and ship systems, but planetary scale engineering is outside my experience. Thane's expression crumpled slightly, but Zara stepped forward quickly. Jake Morrison's expertise lies in finding creative solutions to impossible problems. He approaches challenges differently than our people do. Different how? Thane asked, his voice barely controlled. Jake considered how to explain human problem-solving to an alien whose civilization was clearly more advanced than his own. We have a saying. If you can't fix it with a hammer, get a bigger hammer. It means we don't always follow established protocols when facing unprecedented problems. For the first time, Thane's expression showed interest rather than despair. Unorthodox approaches. Completely unorthodox, Kira confirmed. Jake Morrison once repaired a fusion reactor by using spare parts from a food preparation unit. The principles were the same, Jake protested mildly. Just different applications. Thane leaned forward in his holographic form. Human Morrison, our most brilliant engineers have spent months analyzing this crisis using every established methodology. They have concluded that the failure cannot be stopped with existing technology. We need something that has never been tried before. Jake felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. Tell me about the problem. Thane gestured, and the hologram expanded to show a three-dimensional model of the Zephyrian homeworld. The planet was beautiful, with silver oceans and crystalline continents that seemed to glow with their own light. Our world is artificially maintained, Thane began. 30,000 years ago, our ancestors transformed a dying planet into a paradise using technology we call the deep engines. These systems regulate atmospheric composition, weather patterns, and most critically, core temperature. The model zoomed in to show the planet's interior, revealing massive crystalline structures embedded throughout the mantle and core. The deep engines draw energy from quantum fluctuations in space-time itself, Thane continued. They have operated flawlessly for millennia, maintaining perfect environmental balance, until 3 months ago. The model highlighted a section of the core where the crystal structures were showing signs of degradation. As Jake watched, the degradation spread through the network like a disease. What started the failure? Jake asked. We believe it was triggered by a solar storm of unprecedented magnitude, Thane replied. The quantum resonance chambers that interface with spacetime were disrupted. Since then, the cascade failure has been accelerating. Jake studied the model carefully, his engineering mind automatically analyzing the problem. What happens if the system fails completely? Core temperature will spike beyond sustainable levels, Thane explained grimly. The resulting thermal expansion will crack our planet's crust. Atmospheric venting will begin, followed by complete ecosystem collapse. Our world will become uninhabitable within days of final system failure. And your engineers can't repair the quantum resonance chambers? Thane's expression grew even more desperate. The chambers exist partially outside normal spacetime. Our ancestors built access points, but the knowledge of how to use them safely was lost centuries ago. Every attempt to reach the damaged systems has resulted in the loss of our best engineers. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature. Lost how? They simply ceased to exist? Zara explained softly. The quantum fields around the chambers tear apart anything that enters them improperly. Our people have the theoretical knowledge but lack the practical experience to solve this kind of crisis. But humans might approach it differently, Kira added hopefully. Jake walked closer to the holographic model, studying the quantum chamber design. It was like nothing in human engineering, operating on principles that seemed to violate several laws of physics. But as he examined it, he began to see patterns, connections that might not be immediately obvious to minds trained in Zephyrian engineering traditions. Your ancestors built this system, he mused aloud. They must have had some way to maintain and repair it. Undoubtedly, Thane agreed. But those records were lost in the Great War, 15,000 years ago. All we have are operational manuals and basic safety protocols. Jake touched his pendant unconsciously and felt it pulse with warmth. Suddenly, he had an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if the maintenance knowledge isn't lost, he suggested. What if it's stored in a different way? The three Zephyrians looked at him with confusion. These crystals, Jake held up his pendant, they respond to thought patterns, right? They interface directly with the mind. Yes, Zara said slowly. But what does that have to do with? What if your ancestors didn't store the maintenance knowledge in records or computers? Jake interrupted, his excitement growing. What if they stored it in the crystals themselves, in the quantum matrix that powers your entire civilization? Thane's eyes widened. You think the knowledge is encoded in the deep engine crystals? I think it's possible, Jake replied. And I think these pendants might be the key to accessing it. He explained his theory, that the crystal pendants were not just family heirlooms, but actual interface devices for the deep engine systems. That they had been passed down through generations not as decorations but as tools, that the right person, with the right mindset, might be able to use them to access the ancient knowledge needed to repair the quantum chambers. It's completely theoretical, Jake admitted, and probably dangerous. But if I'm right, the solution to your crisis might be locked away in your own technology, waiting for someone who thinks differently enough to access it. The hologram was silent for a long moment. Finally, Thane spoke, his voice carefully controlled. Human Morrison, what you propose would require you to interface directly with quantum systems that exist partially outside normal reality. The margin for error is essentially zero. If you are wrong, you will cease to exist in any meaningful sense. Jake looked at Zara and Kira, seeing in their faces the same desperate hope he had seen in their childhood eyes during the asteroid storm. Two frightened children had grown into powerful women, but they were still the same people he had chosen to help without hesitation. 4 billion lives, he said simply. 4 billion lives, Zara confirmed. Jake nodded. Then we better get to your homeworld as fast as possible. I have some impossible thinking to do. As the Starweaver's dream adjusted course for maximum speed, Jake spent the remaining travel time studying everything the Zephyrians knew about their deep engine systems. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that his theory was correct, and the more terrified he became of what he was planning to attempt. But every time doubt crept in, he touched the pendant around his neck and remembered the fundamental truth that had guided his decision 10 years ago. When someone needs help, you help them. Everything else is just details. The Zephyrian homeworld appeared ahead of them, beautiful and serene, showing no outward signs of the crisis threatening to destroy it. But Jake knew that beneath its crystalline surface, ancient machinery was failing, and time was running out. He was about to attempt something that had never been tried, using principles he barely understood, to save a world that wasn't his own. The logical part of his mind insisted this was madness. The pendant against his chest pulsed with warm certainty, and Jake Morrison prepared to discover just how far human improvisation could stretch when everything depended on it. The ultimate solution, the Zephyrian homeworld of El-Shaddai, was even more breathtaking in person than in the holographic projections. As the Starweaver's dream descended through crystalline clouds, Jake Morrison pressed his face to the viewport and watched a landscape that seemed sculpted from dreams unfold below them. Cities of flowing, organic architecture stretched across, continents that sparkled like cut gems. The very air seemed to shimmer with an inner light that made everything appear touched by magic. But beneath the beauty, Jake could sense the growing crisis. The ship's sensors detected minute fluctuations in atmospheric composition, slight variations in the planet's magnetic field, and tiny tremors that spoke of massive systems under stress deep within the world's core. The degradation is accelerating, Zara reported from the pilot station, her voice tightly controlled. Core temperature has risen 3 degrees since we left to find you. The evacuation of non-essential personnel from the capital city is nearly complete, Kira added, monitoring communication channels. But there's nowhere to evacuate 4 billion people to, even if we had the ships. Jake felt the weight of an entire civilization settling on his shoulders. Through the viewport, he could see streams of air traffic as people fled the major population centers, hoping to find safety that didn't exist anywhere on their dying world. The landing platform they approached was surrounded by the most massive structures Jake had ever seen, crystalline towers that rose kilometers into the sky, their surfaces alive with flowing patterns of light. At the center of the complex stood a building that seemed to be carved from a single enormous gem, its faceted walls reflecting the light of El-Shaddai's twin suns into rainbow cascades. The Deep Engine Control Center, Zara explained, noticing his stare. Built directly above the primary quantum chamber access point. As they disembarked, Jake was struck by the sheer scale of everything around him. The Zephyrians had built their civilization on a level that dwarfed human achievements, yet all of this wonder was threatened by a problem they couldn't solve. Elder. Thane met them at the platform, accompanied by a dozen other Zephyrians whose formal robes and grave expressions marked them as members of the Technical Council. Up close, Jake could see the strain of the crisis etched in their features. These were people who had exhausted every conventional option and were placing their last hope in the unconventional thinking of an alien engineer. Human Morrison. Thane greeted him formally. Welcome to Vel-Shirai. I wish the circumstances of your visit were different. So do I, Jake replied, shouldering his toolkit. How much time do we have? Perhaps 18 hours before Cascade failure reaches the point of no return, another council member replied. After that, even successful repairs would not prevent planetary destruction. 18 hours. Jake felt his pulse quicken. Then we better get started immediately. They were escorted through the control center, past vast chambers filled with monitoring equipment and technical staff working with desperate efficiency. The building's interior was as impressive as its exterior, with corridors that seemed to flow like frozen water and walls that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. But it was the central chamber that took Jake's breath away. The room was spherical, hundreds of meters in diameter, with walkways and platforms suspended at various levels throughout the space. At the center hung a massive crystal formation that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Its surface shifted and flowed, showing glimpses of spaces that hurt to look at directly. The primary interface, Thane announced. From here, our ancestors controlled the entire deep engine network. Jake approached the central platform cautiously, his pendant growing warmer with each step. The crystal formation was beautiful and terrifying, radiating energy that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges. Your engineers have tried to interface with this directly? He asked. 7 attempts, Thane confirmed grimly. None returned. The quantum fields around the primary interface are highly unstable. Contact without proper preparation results in molecular dissolution. Jake studied the crystal formation, noting the intricate patterns carved into its surface. They weren't decorative. They were functional, some kind of interface system that he didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. The quantum chambers that need repair, he said. They're accessible through this interface? In theory, another council member replied. The primary interface connects to every component of the deep engine network across the planet, but reaching the damaged chambers requires navigating quantum space itself. Jake removed his pendant and held it up, watching how it responded to proximity to the primary interface. The crystal began to glow brighter, and he felt information flowing into his mind. Not words or images, but direct understanding of concepts that his conscious mind couldn't quite grasp. I need to try something, he announced. But first, I need everyone except Zara and Kira to leave this chamber. Thane looked alarmed. Human Morrison, I cannot allow you to attempt interface without medical monitoring and safety protocols. Your safety protocols are designed for Zephyrian physiology and thought patterns, Jake pointed out. I'm human. I process information differently, and I interface with quantum systems differently. Your safety measures might actually interfere with what I'm trying to do. After considerable debate, the council members reluctantly agreed to withdraw to the observation level above, the central chamber. Jake found himself alone with Zara and Kira on the platform surrounding the primary interface, with only his pendant and his engineer's toolkit between him and an impossible task. Jake, Zara said softly, what you're attempting, we don't fully understand the risks ourselves. I know, Jake replied, checking his equipment one final time. But I understand something your people might not. What's that? Kira asked. Jake smiled grimly. Sometimes the best way to fix something is to break it first, then put it back together better than it was before. He approached the primary interface and placed his pendant against one of the carved patterns on its surface. Immediately the crystal formation blazed with light, and Jake felt his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his physical body. Suddenly, he was everywhere and nowhere, existing as pure information in a space that had no physical dimensions. Around him, he could sense the vast network of the deep engine systems, thousands of components spread throughout the planet's core and mantle, all connected by threads of quantum energy. And he could see the damage. The quantum resonance chambers were indeed failing, their crystalline matrices cracked and distorted by the solar storm. But as Jake examined them more closely, he realized the Zephyrian engineers had been approaching the problem all wrong. They were trying to repair the damage, to restore the chambers to their original configuration. But Jake could see that the original design had a fundamental vulnerability, the same weakness that had allowed the solar storm to cause such catastrophic damage in the first place. The chambers needed to be redesigned, not just repaired. Drawing on decades of experience improvising solutions with limited resources, Jake began to envision a new configuration for the quantum resonance chambers. He couldn't build them from scratch, but he could modify the existing systems, use components from undamaged chambers to create hybrid designs that would be more resilient. It was like rewiring a fusion reactor while it was running. Except the reactor existed in multiple dimensions, and any mistake would destroy a planet. Jake lost track of time as he worked, his consciousness moving through quantum space, carefully, disconnecting damaged components and rerouting energy flows. His pendant served as an anchor, keeping him connected to his physical body while allowing his mind to operate on scales that human consciousness wasn't designed to handle. At some point, he became aware that he wasn't working alone. Other presences had joined him in quantum space, not the Zephyrian engineers who had died in previous attempts, but something older. The consciousness patterns of the ancient builders who had originally created the deep engine systems. They had indeed stored their knowledge in the quantum matrix, waiting for someone with the right combination of technical skill and unconventional thinking to access it. But that knowledge came with a warning. The modifications Jake was making would save the planet, but they would also change it fundamentally. Vel-Shirai would survive, but it would be different, more stable, but also more isolated from the quantum fields that had made advanced Zephyrian technology possible. Jake paused in his work, understanding the implications. The Zephyrians would have to rebuild their entire technological civilization using more conventional physics. They would lose much of what made them unique. But they would live. Jake completed the modifications, feeling the quantum resonance chambers stabilize in their new configurations. Deep within Vel-Shirai's core, ancient machinery adapted to new parameters, and the cascade failure that had threatened to destroy the world began to reverse. When Jake finally withdrew his consciousness from quantum space and returned to his physical body, he found himself collapsed on the platform around the primary interface. Zara and Kira were kneeling beside him, their faces etched with concern. "How long was I connected?" he asked weakly. 14 hours, Zara replied. "We were afraid we had lost you." Jake struggled to sit up, feeling like he had been taken apart and reassembled incorrectly. His pendant had gone dark, apparently burned out by the interface process. "Did it work?" he asked. Kira smiled, tears streaming down her face. "Core temperature is dropping. The cascade failure has stopped. You saved us, Jake Morrison. You saved our world." The next few hours passed in a blur of celebration and ceremony. The Zephyrian people, learning that their world had been saved by the human engineer, declared Jake a hero of their civilization. The Technical Council offered him every honor they could bestow, along with wealth and position beyond imagination. But as Jake stood on a balcony overlooking the Crystal City, watching the lights of celebration spread across the continent, he felt only a quiet satisfaction. He had seen a problem that needed solving and found a way to solve it. Everything else was just details. "You could stay, you know," Zara said, joining him on the balcony. "The position we offered is still yours. Our people would welcome you as one of our own." Jake considered the offer seriously. Vel-Shirai was beautiful, and the Zephyrians had become dear to him. But this wasn't his world, and these weren't his people. His place was among humans, sharing what he had learned and serving as a bridge between species. "I need to go home," he said finally. but not to Titan's edge. I think it's time I stopped hiding from the wider galaxy. Kira appeared with a small package wrapped in crystalline cloth. A gift? She explained. Samples of our quantum crystal, technology, and detailed records of the modifications you made to our systems. Perhaps human engineers can learn from them. Jake accepted the package gratefully. This could advance human technology by centuries. It is the least we can do, Zara replied. You gave us our future. We want to help secure yours. 3 days later, Jake stood on the bridge of the Starweaver's Dream as it departed Vel-Shirai orbit. The planet below looked exactly as it had when they arrived, but Jake knew it was fundamentally changed. The Zephyrians faced a long process of technological adaptation, but they would survive and eventually thrive. Where would you like us to take you? Zara asked from the pilot station. Jake thought about the offer carefully. He could return to Titan's Edge, to his workshop and his quiet life. Or he could choose something new. Something that honored what he had learned about himself during this incredible journey. Earth, he said finally. I think it's time human engineers learned about quantum crystal technology, and it's time the galaxy learned that humans are ready to be more than just frontier mechanics and soldiers. As the ship engaged its hyperdrive and Vel-Shirai disappeared behind them, Jake Morrison began planning his new life. He would establish an institute for cross-species engineering, sharing the knowledge he had gained and training a new generation of human engineers to work alongside alien species. The pendant around his neck might be dark now, but Jake carried something more valuable than crystal technology. He carried the understanding that the galaxy was full of problems that needed solving, and that sometimes the best solutions came from the most unexpected places. Humanity was ready to take its place among the stars, not through conquest or commerce, but through the simple human gift of finding creative solutions when others saw only impossibility. And it had all started with a warm meal offered to 2 hungry children during a storm. The circle was complete, but the story was just beginning.